Just hit advance.
It's going to happen. Yeah.
Advance, yeah.
That's it. That's next year's policy.
The technology is getting more
Are we
advanced every
advancing
year.
our own slides?
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Kevin Quigley. I'm the Scholarly Director of the MacEachen Institute for Public Policy and Governance. Thanks so much for joining us. We're so delighted, as usual, to see so many people attending the event. We would like to begin by acknowledging that we're in Mi'kmaq, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. Thanks for coming, and we also like to welcome those people who are live streaming on Facebook. Very excited to be hosting a panel on the future of work. Today's chair will be Jim Barker. Jim is the Herbert S. Lamb Chair of Business Education in the Rowe School of Business and leads the Safety Net RX and Health Assured Pharmacy Safety Research Consortium. Dr. Barker's research interests focus on complex system dynamics and developing safe and sustainable organizational governance mechanisms, public policies, and industry practices. With past experience in aviation safety and public policy, he now studies safety enhancements in Canadian community pharmacies. He's a past academic journal editor-in-chief and has received numerous professional honors, including a Career Achievement Award from the International Communications Association. His publications span a variety of fields, including management, information technology, pharmacy, education, and psychology. Professor Barker is a former U.S. Army officer and has served as a faculty member at prestigious U.S. and New Zealand universities. He has a management industry experience in transportation and consultative experience in a number of industries and government organizations. Please welcome Jim Barker.
Thank you, and it's delighted to have you all here, and I very much appreciate you coming today to be with us today, and we certainly appreciate our panelists for coming and being with us today. How we'll proceed is if you've been to the sessions before, we'll proceed in the same way. We'll have the presentations by the panelists, then we'll have some questions open. First questions will be from a set of students, and then after that we'll open it up to the community for a set of community questions, but we are running toward the 1:30 time, and so that's what's going to, because there's still work to be done in the university besides ours, so we need to finish up at 1:30 so we can get on to the rest of that work. But Kevin asked me to chair today. I got to thinking a bit more about work and ways than I usually do as an organization scholar. And just pause to think for just a moment about work and the importance of work to us and how much time we spend when we're working wishing we were doing something else. There's an odd thing about it. We give work this negative valence to it. And you can see that so much in our popular culture. You know, if you watch The Office or anything like that, you get this, we know that negative valence. But work is so powerful to us. We've always labored together, at least since we first conceptualized the term we and us. We have labored together, whether it's the homes, our communities, our clans, our organizations, businesses, institutions, even carceral institutions. We labor together. But that work brings a lot of consequences to us. It brings social consequences, environmental consequences, economic consequences, as well as all the affordances that it brings too on the social, environmental, and economic level. What policy should do in this space is help us navigate those consequences and affordances and navigate those in a useful way, and that's why we have a discussion on policy. Because work is so important to us. The future for that work will take is tough, difficult. We're uncertain, we're unsure. We don't know what it's going to take. But we do know that whatever happens, we have to navigate what that world of work is because it is such a part of us. And there are long-standing literatures that show how important it is to us as human beings, collective and individual. So that's why it's exciting today, to see what we can start thinking about in a very deliberative way regarding policy around where the future of work is going to take us. And that's what we're going to look at with 4 particular areas today. Our first speaker, Sunil Johal, is a public policy executive and a fellow of the Public Policy Forum at the Brookfield Institute. Sunil has been a policy director at the University of Toronto's Mowat Center, where there you led the research activities on the future of work and the implication of disruptive technologies. That's one of the more key consequences that we talk about these days, are those kinds of disruptions. But perhaps most important of all, since earlier this year, you've been the chair of the expert panel on modern labor standards set up by the Minister of Labour here in Canada. Sunil, welcome.
Good afternoon, everybody. Really great to be back in Halifax. Got to see my sister-in-law's 3-month-old daughter, and she didn't spit up all over me, so that was a success yesterday. So I'm just going to give you kind of a quick overview of some of the key trends in Canada's economy and labor market. What are the impacts of those trends on jobs and skills, and then briefly touch on some potential policy options. And I think my fellow panelists will be fleshing out some of these issues in their presentations and touching on some other pieces too. But in terms of longer-term labor market issues that we should be aware with when we're thinking about the economy, jobs, a really key one is this notion of unequal prosperity. I mean, you've probably heard this in the context of the top 1% or the top 10% in countries like Canada and the United States getting outsized shares of economic prosperity. So this notion of income inequality. And that also manifests itself at the level of wages. I mean, this chart gives you a sense of real wage growth in Canada since the early 1960s. And you can see for about 20, 25 years there, 60s into the late 70s, as the economy grew by 3, 4, 5% a year, people's wages were growing by 3, 4, 5% a year. But what we're starting to see in the past 20, 25 years is wages are stagnating for a lot of people in the labor market. And I'll touch on this a little bit more later. But as the economy grows by 2 or 3% now, for many people, their wages aren't growing. So in Ontario, for example, from 1997 to 2016, so a 20-year chunk of time, if you were in a non-management, non-professional position, which is a lot of people in the labor market, obviously, you saw essentially zero wage growth when adjusted for inflation. So you can imagine when we think about things like populism, where is that coming from? A lot of people in our society are working really hard, and they're looking at their paycheck at the end of every 2 weeks and saying, I'm no further ahead than I was 5, 10, 15 years ago, yet my childcare costs are going up, my energy costs, my housing costs, my food costs, et cetera, et cetera. So this chart kind of peels that onion a little bit more deeply and shows you by percentile between 1976-79 and 2012-15, so about a 30-year period again, by income decile, who is seeing the most gains in terms of household income growth? So the far left is the bottom 10% in Canada and Ontario. Far right is the top 10%. So you can see the bottom 30% or so of folks in Ontario and in Canada, they're actually losing ground when it comes to income over about a 30-year period. So not only are they not getting ahead, they're further behind than they were 30 years ago. Outsized shares of those gains in terms of income by household are going to the top 10, 20, 30%. So kind of building on that point I just made. And another key trend that we're seeing in the labor market in countries like Canada is the rise of so-called precarious work. So in the post-World War II period, generally speaking, when you were entering the labor market, you'd be entering a position that was permanent, full-time, came with benefits, came with a pension. Government provision of other types of benefits like a pension or extended health benefits was really to fill in the gaps. It wasn't really a critical part for most people of their wage and benefits packet. But what we're starting to see recently is far more Canadians engaged in part-time precarious work. Since the mid-1990s in advanced economies, 60% of job growth is in the form of non-standard work. So those are the part-time, temporary, self-employed with no employees types of positions in the economy. And I mean, a third point, which I know some of the other panelists will touch on, is the decline in unionization in Canada. I won't touch on that in any great level of detail, but we're seeing a slow, steady decline in how many workers in Canada are unionized. So taking those three trends into account, income inequality, wage stagnation, declining unionization, we now layer onto that this idea of digitization. So the whole world is changing around us, how value is created, how firms operate, how we communicate with each other, how we live and work. And there are a number of key features around it that are worth paying attention to in the digital economy. So for example, small physical infrastructure footprints. I mean, 30, 40 years ago, a big company would have been a company like General Motors. They would have had a huge campus where thousands of workers are flooding in every day on a number of shifts to make cars. Now you've got companies like Facebook, WhatsApp, Google, which could fit in this room some of those companies. I mean, WhatsApp was purchased by Facebook for about $22 billion about 3 years ago. They had about 40 employees at that time. You don't need a big amount of space to be an incredibly valuable company anymore. And the other notion I think is really worth paying attention to here is the idea of network effects. These platforms like Google and Amazon are increasingly valuable the more eyeballs and the more users they have, right? I mean, if you're looking to sell or buy something online nowadays, almost all of us, our first stop would be something like eBay or Amazon. We're not going to go to the 20th or 25th best online retailer or most trafficked online retailer because there's not as many people in the market. So on the one hand, that's good for us as consumers right now, but you can imagine in 5 or 10 years, what does that mean for competition? How hard is it for a new online retailer to get into the space that Amazon now holds 50% of the market share of? Another trend that we're starting to see a lot of attention to is this notion of automation. So whether we're talking about robotics or we're talking about artificial intelligence, but how is that going to impact the labor market in countries like Canada? So this chart shows you from 1983 till 2014, the labor market in the United States, broken down by 4 different job types. Story in Canada is pretty much exactly the same. But essentially those 2 lines that have seen steady growth, the top red line and the bottom dark gray line, those are non-routine jobs. So the top red line, those are non-routine cognitive jobs. So an engineer, an architect, somebody who's doing a different thing every day, using their mind to make a living. Bottom line, which has also seen steady growth, those are non-routine manual jobs. So an electrician, a plumber, doing different things every day. I mean, electricians in this building one day, then they're going to fix knob and tube wiring in a different part of the city the next. Those middle 2 lines that are stagnating, those are the routine occupations in our society. So whether we're talking about routine manual jobs or routine cognitive jobs. So a routine manual job, maybe a forklift driver taking boxes from one end of a warehouse to another, a routine cognitive job, a telemarketer. You probably get those calls like I do at dinner time. Do you want your ducts cleaned? No, I hang up. I never say yes. One day I'm wondering what happens if I say yes. There's really only 2 or 3 tracks that conversation can take, right? Yes, I do. When do you want to schedule me in? A computer can have that conversation with you right now. We're not going to need tens of thousands of telemarketers calling people up to have those conversations. And again, this chart stops in 2014. We've seen advances in artificial intelligence since 2014. So if you project this forward to 2030, 2040, what's going to happen to the routine jobs in our economy and our society? A lot of projections around this. I won't get into any detail here, but there's no real certainty around how many jobs will or won't be lost to these types of technologies. We're seeing estimates from as low as 5 or 10% of current jobs being automated out of existence, all the way up to about 50%. Key point here is we don't really know. So that kind of builds on to my second topic I wanted to touch on. What's the impact of all of these trends? So number 1, we don't know what's going to happen. When we don't know something, what do? We tend to wait and try and gather more information. So I mean, when we talk to government officials about this around the world, they say this is all very interesting, but maybe this won't be as bad as it seems. Maybe the future of jobs will look much like the current day state of jobs. We don't need to implement transformational, programmatic change. So we'll just wait and observe what will happen. But we're also potentially facing an increased pace of change. So I mean, things like autonomous vehicles could be on the road by 2025, 2030, could eliminate a lot of driving jobs in the country. And moreover, I mean, it's just this constant state of disruption and volatility. It's creating anxiety for young people. It's creating anxiety for people who are mid-career. How do we handle that? So, I mean, on the pace of disruption point, I mean, this chart kind of shows you from in the mid-1860s, half of Canadians lived and worked on farms. Today, that number's under 2%. That was a 140-year slow, steady decline to where we are today. Something like autonomous vehicles, within 10 years, we could see those on the road. Maybe 500,000 Canadians who drive for a living today could be impacted by that change. That's not even a generational amount of time, let alone multiple generations to adjust to urbanization and people moving out of farms. So how do our societal systems adapt quickly to these types of potential changes? One of the big things everybody always talks about in this space is training. Well, if we can just retrain people and upskill them for new jobs, we'll be okay. We'll take that auto worker and get them into a new field. The challenge with that is, in Canada, we are really lagging behind when it comes to our spending on skills training. We're about 6th or 7th from the bottom on this chart amongst OECD countries in terms of spending on active labor market programs. The programs that we do have aren't very effective, and very few people are actually eligible for the programs because your eligibility tends to be tied to EI eligibility, and many people who work multiple part-time jobs or are self-employed aren't eligible for EI. So what kind of jobs are we looking at in the future? I mean, we can talk about this probably more in the discussion. But we're going to be looking at things where there's a high human touch element. So, I mean, education and health, you don't generally want your kids or your parents, if you get along with your parents, being taken care of by robots. I sometimes tell my dad, well, if you're not nicer to me, maybe I will put you in a robot nursing home. He doesn't really like that very much. But also, I mean, obviously jobs that will be involved in the maintenance and development of these new technologies. And these are some of the skills that most of the reports in this space agree will be important. So social and emotional intelligence, more adaptability, more creativity. People who are able to pivot in a labor market where you're not going to have a career, you're going to have many, many part-time, short-term gigs and opportunities. So in the last minute I have, just very quickly, I want to touch on a couple of buckets of policy options that might be able to remedy or address some of these issues. So number one, these are what I would call pre-distribution options. So not really government taxing and spending and getting involved in basic income and those types of things, but more kind of nudges around the margin. So an example on the wage front. So we have a wage stagnation issue. One thing that would be very simple to try and remedy that, more transparency around what people make in the labor market. In Norway, for example, you can look up how much anybody in the country makes for very awkward cocktail parties where you're kind of on your phone checking how much does this person make. I don't know if I want to talk to them. They actually put a check in the system in Norway. Now if you look at how much somebody makes, they know you looked at it. So they saw a dramatic drop off in the queries to the system. But that's something in Canada. If you know how much everybody at your new employer is making, you can negotiate a better pay package. I mean, anchoring the minimum wage to 60% of the average wage, that's another one. And then briefly, I mean, on the redistribution front, that's where we can talk about things like guaranteed annual income, boost to things like pharmacare, affordable housing, where we're taxing the wealthiest Canadians, we're taxing wealth more effectively and redistributing that into programs that benefit others. So thanks for that. I look forward to the other panelist conversations and the questions afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sunil. We appreciate that very much. Karen Foster is up next. Karen is the Canada Research Chair here in Sustainable Rural Futures for Atlantic Canada, and established in 2018 the Rural Futures Research Center here. And so that brings another dynamic to our discussion about the future of work. And particularly if you were at the sessions at the MacEachen Institute held last night, rural-urban issues were a key area at that discussion that we had last night. Now, Karen, working with the center, is focused on how Atlantic Canadians can get the data to understand public policy and how that public policy can inform our use of data, particularly with succession in rural Canada, to explore diverse ways that we can make livings as the rural Canadian landscape changes and shifts. I've written 2 books that we have that are very fascinating. First is on generational approaches, but the one that I would particularly urge to the students here at public policy is the one on the discourses of productivity, because it's those discourses that reflect how we navigate those kinds of issues. Karen, please.
Thank you. I really just want to ask Sunil a bunch of questions and use my time that way, but instead I'll share a little bit of what I've been thinking about. So the I guess, concept note for this day said that we were to consider the future of work in the context of AI, disruptive industries, urbanization, and demographics. And later in the concept note, AI and disruptive industries are kind of collapsed together into technology. So I'm going to start there with technology, but then consider the other two, urbanization and demographics, in turn. So beginning with technology, I want to make two arguments. The first is that we need to avoid technological determinism. There are lots of things that are technologically possible that don't happen, or that happen in I guess, smaller steps or in mitigated ways. There's a few reasons for this. So first, lots of technology depends on somebody with the capital and the appetite for risk to invest in it. So this is, I guess, less the case in digital firms, but it is the case in things like robotics, in areas like agriculture and the fisheries. It is hard to say whether we in Nova Scotia are going to see those people or that amount of capital. The second and related point is that technology, especially robotics, can be very expensive at the outset, and sometimes people are cheaper. For example, it's cheaper in the short run to pay for temporary foreign workers than it is to invest in automation in agriculture. So there is the potential for technology, for automation to solve labor shortages, the acute labor shortages that we see in a lot of rural industries, but at present it is still cheaper to employ people at low wages, and the tech money isn't necessarily there. The third kind of subpoint to this argument that we need to avoid technological determinism is that society does have a say in what happens. One of the mechanisms that we have is policy. But there's also, I guess, sort of just a cultural taste for social change. Lots of tech is unpopular, and it either won't happen or it will be mitigated because people don't like it, because there will be pressure on policymakers not to let technological change kind of run roughshod over what we already do. We thankfully have those checks and balances. One of the interesting pieces of the societal perspective that I was thinking about during the first presentation is the work ethic. It's that attachment to work as a very important central part of our lives that actually has the capacity to push back against automation. Insofar as we can't imagine a world without work. We can barely imagine a world with less work. So if we're not ready to let go of jobs, if we're not ready to embrace, say, a basic income, then we're going to have a really difficult time dealing with automation and the disappearance of certain kinds of work. The second major point that I want to make about technology is that it's wrong to focus too heavily on technological change as kind of the exemplar of the future of work. There's a change that is less exciting and more difficult to trace, and that's the change in employment relations, in the relationship between workers and managers and bosses and now increasingly shareholders. So the relations between people who produce goods and services and those who own the means of production, in Marx's terms. The basic idea of a job, of employment, is that relation between a worker, an employer, and a managerial class and investors. And there have always been alternatives to that model. But now some of those alternatives are cohering into something that we're calling the gig economy. It entails new and emerging alignments of work that involve especially independent contractors who sell their labor to a central body that connects them, that coordinates the work of a lot of independent contractors and connects them to clients or customers. But unlike traditional employers, those central bodies don't offer benefits or guarantees of job security, and they don't even really have to adhere to labor standards because they don't technically have employees. And that's an interesting ground right now for public policy and legislation to try and capture those, actual employment relationships that are flying under the radar because they're being called independent contractors. So a lot of these companies, like app developers, we think of Uber, I think, as one of the main examples. They think of themselves as positively disrupting things, but they do represent a disruption to work relations as we understand them. They're not a clean rupture with work relations of the past. My MA student, who's in the audience, is exploring this in his research, trying to show that this gig economy stuff that looks on surface like it's very disruptive is really the continuation of patterns that have been unfolding since the dawn of the employment relationship. Regardless, the gig economy is growing. There was a study I just looked at in Forbes magazine that found that the gig work makes up 30% of the jobs in emerging economies, and that it's found not just in creative industries where we might expect it or in those kind of one-on-one services, but in agriculture and finance and construction and healthcare. So kind of like other forms of precarious work, it's not just the growth, like the percentage that it takes up, it's the new areas that it's spreading into that we have to keep a finger on. One note of caution that I wanted to add in light of a lot of this talk about increasing precarity is that the full-time salaried, for all intents and purposes, permanent job is still the majority. It's still the most common job type if you look at the statistics. But the feeling of insecurity is certainly on the rise. Job insecurity is actually measured by people who do this kind of research as a perception. It's a feeling. It's not an actual, measure of what's in your contract. And it tends to fluctuate with like broader economic conditions. So that feeling is on the rise, and sociologists know that if people believe that something is happening, they're likely to change their behavior. So it is affecting social life, even if the statistics are just kind of inching up slowly. So the second area that I wanted to talk about is urbanization. And really, I want to just make the point that we are urbanizing in Nova Scotia. Halifax is growing, and it's, I think, mostly at the expense of smaller communities in Nova Scotia and Atlantic Canada. Halifax's growth depends on hollowing out some other places at this point, but it's not written in stone. There have been blips toward rural repopulation. There was a blip in the 1970s. And technology, which played an incredible role in urbanization, can also play a role in counter-urbanization. Right now, we've got, I think, a mix of things that are happening that could nudge people toward rural communities. So we have high house prices in the major metropolitan areas. We are seeing, I think, increasing values cohering around defense against climate change, overcrowded cities, a desire for simplicity, that might mean that we see a little blip. I think that would be kind of interesting, and it's not out of the realm of possibility. Lots of the changes that we say we have to make to prevent climate catastrophe are also aligned with rural repopulation. So we need more small-scale agriculture. That means we need more people in rural communities. We need green energy, which means that we might be able to repurpose some of the extractive industries that whose demise have played a role in rural communities' collapse. So the final part of the title that I wanted to talk about is demographics. So that's the other factor that we're supposed to consider today. We've already seen that there is a link between shrinking population and shrinking economies or economic stasis. It's very difficult to have economic growth without population growth, or at least that's how it's always been. This is what rural places have been dealing with for a century. But what I think we're seeing now is that we have to ask what happens when it's not just rural populations that are shrinking. What does that actually bring? What does it look like? And of course, it means significant change. Just one little bit of research that I do is on occupational succession in rural communities. So looking at family-owned and small businesses where the owners are poised to retire and conceivably they could hand it on within their families, but their kids don't want to do it or are just not in the right place to take it over. And so there's a perception that this is a crisis, that there's lots of viable businesses that are just going to collapse because there's nobody to take them over. So we can bring this urbanization issue back to the beginning, talking about technology, by asking whether or not the risks of shrinking populations might be mitigated by automation. This, of course, was the hope of many economic thinkers of the past, that there would be less work to do because automation would take care of more of the work. And instead of this scenario opening up more leisure time for all of us, it could theoretically just make up for shrinking labor forces, but that would take a lot of policy coordination. In sum, I think looking at Nova Scotia, I doubt that we'll be on the cutting edge of some of these changes, mainly for reasons of just where we are, you know, in the global economy, but also in Canada's economy. But we may be on the cutting edge of some of the issues around rural repopulation, around what smart cities look like in the future. So thank you very much, and I look forward to the questions later.
Thank you, Karen. We're going to shift our focus a bit now, and we're going to look into collaborative ways that we can leverage data, information, and knowledge to policy action, and ways that we can use that knowledge to make a difference. Ian Munro is the chief economist with the Halifax Partnership. Now, in that role, his main tasking is leading a group of individuals that are trying to determine that data, that information, and that knowledge that we need to craft really useful and good public policy. So that's the key work that we're going to talk, that he's going to talk and kind of speak to us about, is how we have and leverage that kind of information in our public and private sector so that we can create the policy that we need. Ian.
Just keep going. There we go. Perfect. That's me. Good. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today. Yes, I work with the Halifax Partnership. We are the city's economic development organization, and our functions include such things as acting as the city's sales force, trying to entice investment here to our businesses to grow and locate and expand their operations. We have a team of people out trying to help local businesses with problems and issues, connect them to resources. We have a number of people focus very specifically on labor market issues and specifically helping immigrants and young people, recent graduates, attached to the labor force. My role today will be taking that Halifax perspective, that Halifax focus. I'm going to try to hit 4 broad points. We've talked quite a bit about technology. I'm going to focus a little bit on that, much more on the demographics. So I'll be speaking about the profound demographic change that's confronting us, changes in the way that businesses are operating in reaction both to technological and demographic change, some of the new policy challenges that presents, and thus the need for new policy responses, probably end up posing more questions than having answers. When I did my own Master's of Public Administration degree in the early 1990s, sorry, at Carleton, not here, our region was characterized by high unemployment, youth out-migration, public policy featuring a high degree of make-work projects. And even though there was a sharp recession at that specific time, this was not a unique moment. This is part of a long trend that had begun in the 1970s and continued for quite some time. As I'll discuss going through the remaining part of my presentation, Halifax has experienced a number of very significant positive turnarounds in recent years, but there are some new looming labor market challenges ahead of us. So let's just quickly look at demographics first. This just gives you the, what are we going back to, over the past 16, 17 years, the population for Halifax, at least in all those left-hand bars broken out by age. The key point here is the growing gray segment at the top. At the turn of the millennium, the senior population was about 10% of Halifax's population. We're now closing in on 20. The working age population over that time has dropped from 65 down to about 60. StatCan produces population projections at the provincial level, but not the city level. So the 3 right-hand bars are provincial numbers, not Halifax ones, so they're not quite the same. But the point there is, again, you see this very, very large growth in the share of seniors and shrinkage in the share of the working age population. And that's going to have some profound impacts in terms of the labor force, the tax base, spending on health care, things like that. So one manifestation of this demographic change is the trend in unemployment. Here you can see that as more and more of the baby boom generation retires and leave the labor force, the unemployment rate, with some fits and starts, is steadily dropping over time. When I think back to when I was at your position in graduate school, the idea of most of Atlantic Canada having unemployment rates below 10 or 12% it just wasn't on. I would note as well that the latest job vacancy rate data came out from StatCan Friday. They've only started publishing this thing in the last 3 or 4 years. Canada and Nova Scotia both hit record highs in the job vacancy rate on Friday, and the Halifax rate was 0.1 of a percentage point from a record high. So in addition to seeing change in the age and size of our labor force, we're also seeing change in the industrial and occupational composition of our labor force. So for example, an aging population is driving demand for healthcare professionals, and the rise of tech-based service sectors driving demand for scientific and technical professionals. And at the same time, manufacturing and resource-based industries are becoming less important in the Halifax employment scheme. And here, when we look at occupations rather than industries, you see the same trend, the same growth in scientific and healthcare professions, and the drop in manufacturing and natural resources. Also interesting is at the bottom there, you'll see the drop in management occupations. And our best sense of this is that what we're seeing is baby boomers and middle management positions retiring, and those positions being red circled, unfilled, as companies flatten their hierarchies. So these structural changes coincide with an evolution in the approach many businesses have taken to achieving success. And here I base my next few comments on what I learned from my colleagues who deal with businesses every day, either helping them here or trying to bring them to Halifax. So we sat down with those people, my colleagues and I in my research group, and talked to them about how business perceptions and what points were key to them in trying to attract a company to come here rather than to Saskatoon or Vancouver or anywhere else. So 20 years ago, and I'm generalizing a bit here, but 20 years ago we were chasing call center opportunities on the basis of cheap labor, and a low Canadian dollar. Now we chase high-tech operations in finance and software, and our key selling points are highly educated and skilled labor. Businesses now worry less about salary levels than they do about factors that will make employees want to stay in Halifax. We even went back and looked at some of our old marketing materials from 20 years ago, the brochures and reports that we used. And I wasn't there at the time, but that my organization used. And the same concept is there. Then it was focused on labor cost and cheap dollar. Now it's focused on the availability of the employees that businesses need and the quality of life that will keep them here. Those are the key selling points. So with changing demographics and changing business practices, we encounter changing policy challenges. So in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, the dominant policy concern was high levels of unemployment. That's now been turned on its head, and a major concern is looming labor shortages. So every spring, my organization commissions a survey of Halifax businesses to get their sense of these issues. And what you can see here is that there's a high degree of satisfaction with the quality of the Halifax labor force, with 64% giving some form of positive outlook on the quality of the labor force. But you can see that the availability of labor in Halifax is regarded as a disadvantage by almost half of businesses, and that is a growing number year over year. Just another piece of evidence of this trend. To see where labor shortages may be most acute for Halifax, we looked through a variety of reports by other organizations and did some back-of-the-envelope math. And this gives just sort of a rough sense of where we think the labor market may be tightest in the coming years. And again, it kind of fits into that trend of growth in technology and a relative decline in manufacturing and resource industries. So it's important to note that while the relatively old populations of Atlantic Canada make labor shortages particularly pressing here, similar circumstances are taking place across the country, and indeed across most of the developed world. So in the future, Halifax is going to be competing for skilled labor not only with Hamilton and High River, but also with Hobart and Houston. It's a problem that is not, we're a little further ahead in the curve, but we're not unique in facing this challenge. So in the face of looming labor shortages, there are broadly three things we can do: get more people, increase the labor force attachment of the people we do have here, and/or make the workers we have more productive through skills, training, capital, equipment that makes them more, that increases their productivity. So drilling down one level, there are also, this will make sense in a moment, there are multiple ways to grow the population. More babies is one option, but that gets a bit tricky in terms of public policy initiatives. So the recent hurricane gave me an idea. What if every couple under 50, when there's a power outage, got a Barry White Alp and a bottle of red wine? Even if this idea did take off, though, that's not going to give us any labor force impact for a generation. So we need to be looking instead, in the shorter term, at attracting migrants and retaining our young graduates here. And on this front, I can actually point to some recent success. In the past 2 years, Halifax has seen record levels of population growth driven by record levels of immigration, and that's even above and beyond the one-time bump that came with the Syrian refugee influx. So we've had a very good trend going, and hoping that continues. In concert with many other public and private organizations, my organization has been working to boost immigration and population growth. And for example, we have a team of people who goes out and meets with local businesses every day and tries to educate them about, and if they're interested, help them attach to the Atlantic Immigration Pilot. And we've seen some good success there, and you can see the growth there. Another bright spot is the increasing rate at which international students are staying here in Halifax after graduation. When the One Nova Scotia, or more colloquially the Ivany Commission, issued its report in 2014, I guess it was, they set a 10-year goal, a 2024 goal, to have 10% of international graduates stay in Halifax after graduation. And that was effectively a doubling. The rate at the time was around 5%. So this was a target of 10% for 2024. I'm pleased to report that in the last year or two, we've actually crossed that threshold already. It doesn't mean it can't go back down, but we've seen some good progress there. And we've also seen some very good turnarounds in youth retention. We spent about 30 years, each and every single year, exporting young people to other provinces. We established a program called the Game Changers Program 3 years ago. In the first year, we got that number drastically down, and in the last 2 years, it's actually gone net positive. So Nova Scotia is now an importer of young people from other provinces. The last 2 points, labor force participation and productivity. I'm going short on time, so my quick point on labor force participation is that you can see varying levels of participation across different segments of society. And there are probably going to be tailored responses needed to help those different segments. So for example, with women having a lower than average participation rate, we need to be investigating more to the extent that perhaps it's childcare accessibility that's the issue, because more often they bear the brunt of those kind of responsibilities at home. For people with disabilities, maybe there are more different kinds of accommodations we can make to assist them there. And lastly, I'll just speak about productivity very quickly. The short story is that Canada lags most of its peer countries in terms of investment in capital equipment and R&D. Nova Scotia lags most Canadian provinces. This is not a good news story. The good news I do have is that the same survey I mentioned, we've seen sharp upticks in the last 2 years about local business intentions to invest in capital equipment and to invest in R&D. So there's a problem, but at least we're seeing some response in the right direction. And with that, I thank you very much for your time, your time.
Thank you, Ian. Sandra McKenzie is going to bring us now a provincial public policy perspective on the future of work and what that work brings. Sandra's had a number of years of experience with provincial public policy, especially in the areas of education and workforce development. I served as the Deputy Minister of Education, Early Childhood Development, Deputy Minister for the Department of Labor and Advanced Education, Acting Deputy Minister for the Department of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism, and lately has been working in strategic planning for the Halifax Port Authority. Sandra, thank you very much.
Okay, you're a wizard. So I have the opportunity now to bat at the end, and we had really interesting presentations that discussed what we can do from a policy perspective in terms of the future of work and with the data. And I'm actually going to offer some observations about, and I call it the observations from the bleachers, because I've actually stepped out of my formal role with the province, and I have an opportunity now to talk about all these things that I thought about for a very long time. But I do want to just say there's 3 things you need to know behind everything I'm going to say. One is, remember that disruption happens from outside. Innovation happens from inside. So when you're innovating, you've got some control over it. Disruption happens when you feel like you've lost control. So when we say we want to be the disruptors and those types of things, but you're doing it inside your own space, you're actually innovating. And you need to remember that, because disruption takes things by storm and changes the way we think about the world. The third thing I just wanted to say is that what is driving all the change in the world is us. And people tend to want to think about it's happening outside of us, and we have to come up with policies in order to be able to address those. But actually, consumers are driving almost every change in the world. And that's become very, very clear to me as I've been working with the Port of Halifax. The shipping industry is responding to Amazon. People being able to buy things, which is effectively, when I was a kid, we waited for the Sears catalog to come, and we would, take dibs on who got to see it first, especially the Christmas catalog. Amazon crowdsourced things that people wanted and made it available through technology, and we bought it. And we expected it to be very quick. We expected it to be very, as high quality as we could potentially get, and we're able to track it on our phone. And that changed transportation. That changed the shipping industry. It didn't start inside those industries and drove it out. So we have to think about our own behavior as we're taking a look at where we're going. So I'm just going to give you a couple of observations related to that. The first is the current workforce will need constant upgrading, but it's unclear who's going to do it. So we talk all the time about we're going to need to be doing training. We need to train, we need to train. Who's going to do the training? Particularly for the current workforce. Our current education systems are not designed to deal with current workforce in the way that we're going to need to be able to do it for the future. So universities are innovating all the time. The disruption is going to come when people want to be able to do badging, I think that you've talked about. They're going to want to be able to do short-term training to get them to here, and they don't care where it comes from as long as it's recognized by the employer, which we'll see more employers offering training that they recognize themselves. So it actually is going to be, there's going to be a disruption that comes to education. And what happens is that if we don't find a way to ensure that the current workforce can be educated and retrained, it means that they will become the skills mismatch. So what is happening is when people are constantly out saying, okay, the employer wants this, and the skills are over here, and then how do we close those gaps? First, who's going to do it? And the second is, how often are we going to do it? And if we don't do it, those skills mismatch people will become our social unrest. That's what's happened, and this is driving social unrest in the world, and it is one of the things that we need to be very, very careful with in terms of a policy perspective, because the answers to social unrest come with making sure that people are prepared, and we're not doing that in the way that we can or should. Number 2, employers are struggling to describe the workers they need. So we assume that employers can train, but we just had a fascinating, we're doing a digital roadmap for the Port of Halifax, and we had a lot of conversations with our own supply chain. And in that conversation, one quote really stands out to me, or one statistic stood out to me. One question was, do you think you'll be able to hire workers? Yes. Do you think those workers will have the skills that you need? No. So they think that they can get the people, they're going to be able to hire people, but that people aren't going to have the skills that they need. And in further sort of conversation, it became very clear that it's because they're having a hard time themselves describing what it is they need in the worker, because it changes rapidly, and it means that somebody may come into the job and it didn't match, and they're either they drive up the credentials or they are cross with the people that somehow delivered the education. But the truth of the matter is that, in a conversation I've had recently with the Nova Scotia Community College, it used to be that we had something called program advisory committees. We'd go out and we'd talk to business, find out what they needed, go back and make sure the programs matched. That's not an option anymore, because that base is based on the premise that businesses can describe exactly what it is that they're looking for, and they're struggling with that, and that's something we're going to have to work through. 3, some of the characteristics we attribute to millennials are a myth. So one of the things I think that is really interesting is that we talk all the time about millennials want good work-life balance or a better life. Of course, good for you guys. And like, I mean, that is awesome. They also want to be able to be engaged in their work, and they want to be able to be challenged and those types of things. That's, of course, that's wonderful work. And that's what we should all be striving for. But by the 30s, when people start having children, they're looking for places that are going to offer benefits. They're looking for dental benefits. They're looking for some way to save for the future. And the more work becomes precarious and the less options people have to be able to do those things, it's not because people don't want them. It's okay, we're going to have a gig economy and we're going to continue to do it. It means that they don't have the opportunity that I did and many of my generation did in order to be able to then onboard to that after you've had your opportunities to do your various things that you like to do in your 20s and early 30s. So I think that we need to be careful to think about who's benefiting from keeping a gig economy, who's benefiting from keeping work precarious, and it's not being driven necessarily by the millennials. So I think that's something that we need to just keep in mind. The fourth is 4.0, Industry 4.0, we aren't ready. So there's lots of conversations about autonomous vehicles. Yes, you know what? We can actually drive an autonomous vehicle from here to Toronto right now, pick up IKEA furniture and come home. Now we have an IKEA now, but in any case, autonomous vehicles can go at the speed of a train. Like, how's that going to work on the 401? We don't have the infrastructure, the legislation, or the regulations that are going to allow many of these things to happen. That's a boon for you guys. That's a gold mine in terms of jobs. Look in terms of who are going to be the people that are actually trying to figure out how does all of this stuff going to be allowed to work? That's an opportunity for you to think about into the future. So we're not ready for the autonomous. We're not ready necessarily for the robotics and those types of things because we haven't worked out yet what are the environments those things are going to work in. Just because we can doesn't mean we're ready to do it, and it means that there's an opportunity for all of you to think that through. Observation number 5, unions are struggling with fear in their membership. I noticed that we were talking earlier about employers, and we were talking about workers, and we were talking about policymakers, but unions are a big part of this discussion, and I had the opportunity to sit in on a full-day session with a very large union that was talking about fear in their membership being driven by the media. And that then ends up being what they end up having to be forced to negotiate with employers when they don't necessarily think that's even the best thing for the worker. So that is a real conundrum that unions are facing right now because, you know, we have conversations about autonomous people taking their jobs will be automated. McKinsey says about 5% of jobs will be automated, but 80% of jobs will be affected. So in this conversation that we had, nobody in the room wanted to go back to when you manually lifted flour from the dock and lifted it onto a ship. Everybody's very happy we have cranes. They just want to make sure that wherever we're going in the future, that they're part of that conversation. So that careful conversation is going to be something that's extremely important, and unions are, that's an opportunity for the public administration students and others to realize that there's an opportunity to have good dialogue there in terms of how can we make sure that the membership is not fearful and that you're not negotiating from a place of fear. Just as an aside, the Port of New York just negotiated with their union 10-year, or I think it was negotiated down to 8 years no automation. That's not going to help the workers themselves in many ways. So there's an opportunity there to have that. We need to work that through. Now, everybody's going to go to sleep when I talk about math, but don't. Because you were always told math's important, math's important. Well, here's the truth. People don't know that math's important. So I was the last going off, I was the Deputy Minister of Education. I was very, very, very surprised to figure out, because I kept going back and saying, no, bring me back the stats, bring me back the stats. Of the children, and this is Nova Scotia stats I'm quoting here for the benefit of everyone. It is consistent, what I'm going to say is consistent across the country. Of the kids that start in grade 10 math, in academic math, only 50% graduate with academic math by grade 12. They graduate with a math, but not academic math. Now, what does that mean? Every growth sector in this country requires an academic math strength. So 50% of kids are moving out of, so that can't be closed with short-term training. That is something that we actually need to become better at. We need to identify it. 2 minutes, I'm going to go really quick. We need to identify it and go and make sure that we are raising little mathematicians in Canada the way we raise little hockey players, which is a full community effort to make sure that people are out there, that we say that math's important, that everyone commits for the rest of their life to never say that I hate math, I'm not going to make you take math. For all of you there, curiosity will be the #1 attribute. Say it, put it on your resume. Don't, people will say, I'm willing to train. That's not being curious. That's not being constantly learning yourself. And that is going to be the #1 attribute in learners into the future. And this is why policy matters. People need a good storyteller now to tell them where we are and where we're going. So I'm going to go down through these quickly. Good policy creates a narrative which helps with wayfinding. People don't know where we're going. They need someone to help them to understand that. Good policy can help understand where we're going. Good policy helps people navigate from the big picture to the personal and back again. They want to know, why are we going on this trip? Good policy mitigates risks and highlights and opportunities. What is it that we can do? Good policy requires partnerships when everyone contributes. This is not a government decision. This is or action only. This is all of us together. That's the who. And good policy is both big vision and little deliberate steps, so that people need to understand where you're going, why we're going there, where they fit, and what are the little steps that we can take along the way, and people feel that they're on a journey as opposed to in a maze. And that's my wrap up. Thank you.
Sandra, thank you very much. At this point, we're going to move into our questions. And as always, we have a set of students that ask the first questions. And they will model the effective ways for asking the questions, because they're going to direct their questions to one person. So as you're thinking about the questions that you would like to ask, remember, we do ask that you address that question to a particular panelist. Nasser, you're up first.
I just wanted to thank the panelists for their comprehensive insight. And my question is for Ian Munro regarding the aging labor force. In 2015, 1 in 5 Canadians aged 65 years and older reported working during the year, the highest proportion since 1981. Do you believe the continued labor participation of seniors will limit opportunities for younger workers?
So yeah, we've seen, as you note, the biggest increase in labor force participation across demographic groups in recent years has been in the senior cohort. I think part of that is that your average 66, 67-year-old now is probably in better shape, healthier, more able to work than his or her counterpart 20, 40, 50 years ago. I think you're seeing, I think an interesting question is the extent to which people are continuing to work because they wish to, which I think is the case, often the case. People want to remain active. They want to maybe move from their traditional career to something entrepreneurial they've always wanted to try and had to delay during the early part of their year. But there may also be a subset who are forced to work. They would like to retire but don't have the means to do so. The impact on younger workers, I'll put it this way, I don't see increased senior participation being a negative impact for younger workers, and mainly because of this bigger trend. There's going to be lots of jobs to go around, essentially, to the extent that, or even for a more local consideration, you can imagine a company wanting to set up shop here and being really concerned about the number, can they get the workers they need? If their make or break decision on staying here or moving to a larger community, like Toronto, Vancouver, the larger workforce, is the availability of labor, and if seniors can fill some of that gap by staying on in the 60s or 70s, that, in a sense, that's actually helping the younger workers. So there are probably also other ways that they can be more beneficial. I think more and more seniors are also staying on maybe as part-timers, going down to 2 days a week, that sort of thing, can provide help with mentoring, transition for younger people. So I guess I'll just summarize by saying I don't see the increased participation of seniors as being a dark omen for the younger generation.
Thank you. Tessa.
Tessa.
Tessa. All right, no, so Tess not here. That means Katrina.
My question is for Dr. Foster. The Brookings Institution said earlier this year that most jobs affected by AI would be the production and food service industries in small rural communities, while those in the entertainment, health, and science industries would be safest due to the creative energy that computers couldn't replicate. Do you agree with this? And I know you said we're not going to be at the cutting edge of these type of replacements in Atlantic Canada, but do you think this is something that we need to worry about?
You said it's in production
Yeah.
and food services. That's fine, I think. I think I would temper it with what I said earlier, which is that whether or not we actually see automation in those places, and particularly in rural communities, depends on whether the establishments in question actually do invest in the technology. It's not, they don't invest just because it's available, or just because a graph says, that this is the place where automation is likely to occur. It does require decision-making on the part of those businesses. And at least what I see in rural Atlantic Canada is that we're not talking about really big manufacturers, and I don't know that they would have the capital to do that. I think that the bigger risk would probably be that they close or move or start to rely on short-term, temporary, low-wage workers.
Okay. Yes, thank you very much. And now we'll turn to Robert.
Hello, and thank you to the panel for being here. My question is for Sandra McKenzie. I'm interested in what role you think that organized labor will play in facing the challenges of a changing world of work, and how the labor movement also will have to change in response to automation and urbanization and all the changes that we're seeing here. Globalization, sorry, that's the key one.
So I talked about that a little bit earlier. I do feel that unions are facing tremendous changes. One is fear amongst their membership in terms of automation. I would also say that they're facing social media driving many of the feelings that are inside the union membership. Now, having said that, and I do believe that they're going to have to think about their own structure, the way they engage their membership, that in fact unions have a long history and have been important at every disruption of through history. So do I think that they can play a role? I absolutely do. Do I think that they're going to be doing that in different ways? I think that they will have to do that as well. But that many of the benefits that we enjoy today as workers have come that were hard fought and won by unions. And so I feel that there's a role and a place for them, but that adapting what has been a very traditional way of union management is going to have to adapt to the sort of the new world order.
Thank you very much. And Sunil, the Tessa's question would have been directed at you, so if I could just ask one quickly on her behalf. And I'm thinking right at the very end when Sandra's talking about the stories and the stories that we tell, because we have this built-in fear of disruption, and particularly because, as I said, it comes from the outside. But to help to mitigate those issues that we will naturally have with disruption, what story should we tell ourselves about disruption that would facilitate our ability to come to terms with it, to navigate it?
Well, I wish you hadn't asked that question, because that's a hard question to answer. I think a lot of the focus in these conversations is on the negative consequences, so jobs lost, jobs destroyed due to automation. We have to remember there are lots of other jobs will be created as a result of new technologies. As mentioned in one of the earlier presentations, we're starting to see technology not just replace muscle power, but also now thinking power. So does that free us up as humans to be more creative, engage in more leisure pursuits? We don't have a problem in the world of not enough wealth. The problem is the distribution of that wealth is inequitable. I think if we can move to a place where technology continues to create wealth for us and opportunity and increase productivity, that's wonderful, but we need to focus on the distributional elements of that. And if we do that, we could certainly see a world where people work less, have very high standards of living, have more opportunity to do the things that they enjoy doing. But we have to consciously make that choice. I mean, I think you mentioned the technological determinism issue, and that's very relevant here. I mean, these things aren't just happening to us. Like, people are making these decisions, and we're electing governments that are allowing certain policies and regulations to be in place. So, I mean, if we collectively want a certain type of future with good quality jobs and decent standard of living, we can create that future, and it's being done in lots of parts of the world. I mean, if you look particularly at the Scandinavian countries, they kind of model a lot of the things we're talking about here in terms of more inclusive growth, less income inequality. So it can be done, and if we want that as Canadians, we can do it.
Thank you very much. So now we'll turn to the community for questions. And again, remember, as you ask your questions, please address your questions to one of the panelists. Yeah, and we'll pause for just a moment to make sure the microphone catches up to you. Yes.
Hello, my name is David Stewart, and I'm part of the senior cohort, I guess, for lack of a better thing. I would like to ask a question to Ian. We have declared a climate emergency. Now, where does the opportunities lie in the declaration of that? And how are we going to make this mega change over the next 10 years with and educate the people and see the jobs that are coming? Because there'll be a lot of jobs doing this shift from fossil to renewables.
That's a biggie. I guess I would answer it this way. Yes, various governments, including Halifax's council, have declared an emergency. I confess I don't know what legislative impact that has itself. It has symbolic value. In time, I suspect that these measures, whether in Halifax or anywhere else, will drive policy decisions, and those policy decisions will involve the expenditure of resources and different things going on and plans to tackle these things. Where that will actually turn out in terms of who's working, doing what job precisely, I don't know. I suspect you're right in that there will be a wealth of opportunities for people with the right skills, whether it's environmental engineering or remediation or modeling of those sorts of things. But I'll confess also I don't have the depth of expertise in these climate matters to tell you much more than that.
We'll have one more question from the left side of the room, then we'll move to the right side of the room.
Hi, my name is Larry Haven, Professor Emeritus of Management at St. Mary's University, and I'm with an organization called Equity Watch. Right now, Nova Scotia is the only jurisdiction in Canada that has neither introduced nor announced introduction of a legislation against bullying in the workplace or psychological harassment. And this question's for any of you who want to answer it. Given the trends you've described, does that put us firmly in the 20th or even the 19th century, or does it put us way ahead of the pack in the new economy where presumably bullying won't happen in the workplace?
Hello, Larry. So that's an interesting question. It's been a debate for some time. I do know that there is legislation, I believe, related to mental health and in the workplace, and I know that's a concern of Occupational Health and Safety and the Workers' Compensation Board. I am familiar with the type of legislation you're speaking to, but I hadn't actually thought about it in the context of whether we could be on the cutting edge of, in terms of what the new workplace is going to look like. I can say that, not specifically to the workplace, but in general, that technology has not made us nicer people. and that we see it all the time in terms of Twitter rants and from some of the people that you would at least expect it from. So I don't know that just we can assume that moving into a world where we're not considering how we can manage bullying and others in a workplace, in a gig, in whatever place that you find yourselves. I think it's a provocative way that you've put it, and I would expect that from you, and that you've given me some food for thought.
Yeah, I'll just add one thing. So, I mean, part of the work I was doing this year with the federal government on labor standards was around, should there be a right to disconnect from electronic communications for workers? So the idea that when you're in your off time, if you're getting an email from your boss or a colleague, should you have to reply to that, or is that something that you can wait till Monday to do? So the reason I'm bringing that up is labor standards, whether it's around bullying or things like that, need to also evolve with the times, because things do change, and kind of cyberbullying didn't exist 20 or 30 years ago. Electronic communications didn't exist 30 years ago. So, I mean, we need to look at all facets of our policy environment, and labor standards are one of them. And the federal government hadn't really updated the Canada Labor Code since the 1960s when it was introduced. So, I mean, there were some amendments coming in 2017, 2018, but you can't wait 50 or 60 years to update these major pieces of legislation. So at the provincial level, Nova Scotia, as all provinces, should be looking at employment standards, labor standards, saying, are there things that have evolved in our society in the past 5, 10, 20, 30, 40 years since we've last looked at these issues that we need to look at? So I think that would fall into that bucket as well.
We'll move now to the side of the room.
Thanks. My name's Steve Warburton, and I come at this from the trenches. And I've got a couple of experiences in my background that I've looked at, and as I move from profession to profession, Sandra, I would agree with what you're saying about we aren't ready. What I would also say is the majority of Nova Scotians, as I see it, are saying, we don't want to get ready, thank you very much. We see a lot of inertia, and I can tell you that from the time I was in government, I spent my 8 years in the bureaucracy, and then I also spent 4 years on the school board. I was chair of the policy committee on the school board. I would ask them at those meetings, what do we see the education system looking like in 10 years? They said, we have no idea. I said, if we don't know what it is, we better pick a place and aim for it. They still said, we have no idea. And we continue, unless we have leadership, unless we have values, unless we have people come forward to help these young people, or perhaps these young people are the future, how are we going to get people to move? How are we going to get this inertia to break through this inertia, and instead of having these things happen to us, we provide more and more leadership? And I know you were a person in government who did that, so that's why I'm addressing this to you.
Was I the inertia? I hope not. So I believe that there's people in all phases of the education sector currently that are innovating. So I believe that there is very, very good work that's being done in a variety of different places. My concern is that disruption happens from outside, and unless we're watching for it or imagining what that could potentially be, that disruption will happen, and our planning won't have prepared us for it. So I think we're agreeing with each other that it's actually a conversation that we need to have related to what does education at all levels look like into the future, and how can we prepare, and that I believe that some of those answers exist now. Those disruptions are starting to happen. The momentum is starting to build, and what we need to do is track it and start to think about, okay, what is that going to mean for us as institutions, as departments that are responsible, as regional education centers, those types of things, because it's only by, and I don't know if in the space of our regular work, we're leaving enough space to think about what's happening in the bigger world, because we're so busy that it's difficult. And so we're counting, I think, on institutions, on the universities, and on the work that my colleagues here are doing to actually guide us into the future.
We have another question from the right side of the room.
Hi, I'm Ren Thomas. I'm a professor at the School of Planning. And my question is probably for Sunil and Sandra. Sandra was saying that employers have difficulty now articulating what skills they want or what they want in employees. And that's something I've heard for quite a long time. I'm just wondering if we can kind of unpack that a little bit more and understand like what exactly is going on there. Are the jobs becoming more complex? Are the skill sets becoming like, are they so different from the past that it's hard to articulate, or like what's going on there? Because of course, I'm part of School of Planning, you know, we're part of a very closely accredited profession. So our students graduate with the skills that are very closely reflected in the workplace, and we get a lot of feedback from employers on that. So I'm wondering what's happening in those professions that are not as closely tied to maybe accreditation standards, that maybe this is maybe what you're talking about.
Sure. So yeah, I think there's a number of different issues going on there. I mean, I mentioned in my presentation that Canada, in terms of public spending, is significantly below our peers in terms of labor market spending. What I didn't mention is that Canadian corporations are also spending about 30% less on training their employees now than they did in the early 1990s. So in some ways, we're in kind of an interesting spot where I think the private sector is holding back and not spending to train their employees to get the skills that they might need in the labor market, and hoping the public sector steps in and provides that training. And one of the bridges there are things like apprenticeships, more workplace integrated learning for students, whether in K-12 system or in the post-secondary system. And I think those are models we really need to pursue much more actively. I mean, 50% of the people who start apprenticeships in Ontario drop out before they complete the program. That's an unacceptably high rate. We know we have shortages in the skilled trades across the country. How do we adopt models that they've got in places like Switzerland and Germany, where this is part of the school system, and it's very well developed. It's kind of not viewed as, oh, well, you're not smart enough to make it into university, you're going into the trades. I mean, you make more money in the trades in many cases than you would going into university in those countries, or in the same situation here in Canada. So I think it's a bit of a mindset shift. How do we make those careers more appealing to people, and how do we develop systems that actually generate better outcomes, particularly for women, for visible minorities who tend not to be as represented in those types of opportunities. So I don't really think we have a skills mismatch per se. I think we've got a bit of a lack of understanding of all parties of who's responsible for what in terms of providing those skills. And I think private sector needs to come to the table, as does the public sector, and make sure we have a skill strategy in place in Canada. We've never really had that conversation at a national level. What's the federal role, provincial, employers, institutions? These things are all kind of happening in a very fragmented way. So I think we've got to have a plan, get everybody at the table, and then start executing the plan.
Can I just do a quick
Yes.
add to that? So we'll have to have a conversation later about, because I do think that there is a skills mismatch, but I can tell you in that same work that we did with, I was working with Andrew Black there at the back, that when we talked to employers, one particular thing stood out to me. One employer said, I know change is coming, but I don't know if I should invest in people, invest in technology, or buy new capital, and in terms of trucks. They didn't know what to do. So I think that there's that we can't line that enough, that there's an opportunity to work with employers to help them understand. The other thing that they're drowned in data. They don't know how to pick out the good data from the bad data. And that's another opportunity in terms of the people that are in this room moving forward. And between those two things, that we can help employers get to where you're talking about.
We'll move back now to the left side of the room. We have two questions from this side.
Hi there, this question is for Dr. Foster. In the conversation that we were having in class just before the panel started, a couple of other students brought up basic income or guaranteed minimal income. What role do you see that playing in the future of work, if any role at all?
Yeah, I mean, I see a role for basic income. I came at basic income and became an advocate for basic income through my research. Because in doing my own studies of the great decoupling, you know, the gap between rising productivity and stagnating or even decreasing wages, what I noticed was that we, like I said before, we can't really imagine a world without work. We still seem to believe that the way that you look after yourself and your family is by working hard, but that connection is starting to be severed. Unless we have some mechanisms to ensure that employers pay a real living wage, we don't really have many other options, particularly if we do see increasing automation, and if we do want to take advantage of the benefits of automation, such as more leisure time. There doesn't really seem to be another way. At the same time, we have a very dysfunctional social assistance system. And I don't mean that it's like, you know, the help that hurts or some other kind of, I'm trying to say a nice word, some other kind of thing that you might hear about it. But just that, that people who find themselves on social assistance for whatever reason are often, you know, they're just in this kind of revolving door or just lineup after lineup trying to prove their worth for social assistance, for disability payments. And so if there was a way of, you know, amalgamating those without cutting them in any way, I think you would eliminate a lot of the costs of just the administration. It just seems to make a lot of sense, particularly in rural places where we have seasonal, a high degree of seasonal variation in jobs. You know, it's that or EI, and EI can be cumbersome.
There was another question on this side.
Hi. Thank you, first of all, for your talk. It's for Sunil or Sandra or both. You acknowledge how our responses to the changing workforce, our job climate's mostly reactive. We don't know what's coming down. We need more information to really understand what's going on. But there was some discussion about, you know, also the downsides of the gig economy, which has almost been like a piecemeal response to that, I think, and, you know, whether it's millennials kind of just adapting. And I'm thinking specifically about like the class action lawsuit that was filed against Skip the Dishes. In that respect, where I haven't been following it, so I don't know where that's at, but it's you know, unfair working conditions and classifications of workers. So how can we be thinking about, you know, Sandra, what you said regarding society and citizens driving change before it gets to the point where we're launching a class action lawsuit? Like, how can we get involved and advocate before that?
I have a quick thought, and then do you want
Yep, sure.
I mean, I think Sandra hit the nail on the head. I mean, I've said this in a number of talks in the past, but it's consumer preferences that are driving these decisions. So we all want something quicker, faster, easier, so we'll order something on Skip the Dishes or Uber Eats, or we'll order Uber instead of a cab. But fundamentally, we're driving then the erosion of working conditions in the labor market. There's obviously a place there for government to step in and ensure that we have bare minimum working standards and labor standards, and that will hopefully happen. But that can lag. I mean, government reactions often are years behind market conditions. So I mean, I think we need to think about as consumers, what types of communities do we want to live in? Do we want to enjoy the convenience of Airbnb, or do we want to recognize that that's going to drive up housing costs and decrease rental affordability in large cities? And again, it's very easy to make the individual, personal, rational choice without taking a step back and thinking, if hundreds or thousands or millions of us are making the same choices, there's some kind of not so great consequences that arise from those decisions. So I think it's a tricky area to step into, because individually each of our choices make sense, but collectively then this is driving us to a place where in our downtowns we're only going to have Starbucks and Tim Hortons, and there'll be no independent retailers. It'll just be Amazon that's available to us because it's the cheapest, quickest thing to do. But I think awareness of that and how we make our decisions matters. And if we want local businesses to flourish, guess what? You actually have to shop at local businesses. You can't just kind of pay lip service to it. So I think more awareness of kind of these macro conditions and how your individual choices play out is important. But I mean, again, we've talked a number of times, but there's a lot of data and information out there. It's really hard for the individual person to kind of always make the quote-unquote right decision.
We're under 5 minutes now, and I want to give the right side of the room a chance. If there's questions over here. Yes, right there.
My question's for Dr. Foster. I'm interested in what you think about the future of teleworking and how that is becoming more of an option for people with the revitalization of rural areas and rural communities. And is there any evidence that that is a positive impact, or is there not a whole lot of research done on it yet?
Yeah, it's good to frame it around the research, because I don't know of much in the way of data on how many people are now like working remotely. But anecdotally, the people that I'm talking to are talking about this as being more of an option now, particularly where we're more likely, you know, in younger generations to be in a dual earner household. The question of where to live comes down to, you know, where can two people find work? So if one person is working in a bricks and mortar rural place, maybe the other person can work remotely. That depends on infrastructure. It depends, obviously, on better internet in rural places, but we are seeing action federally on that, so that's actually kind of exciting. And the one way that it reveals itself in my work is that the perceptions on the part of older people in rural communities are often worse than the reality in terms of just how much decline there is, because they go downtown and they don't see the same signs of work as they know it. But then, you know, someone who's more attuned to these things goes and says, well, you know, how is there a cafe that's very busy, and there are people who are obviously working and they're coming for their coffee, and, you know, where are they working? They're not working in a plant or in a store in the same way. So I'd be interested if someone did start collecting data, and, you know, we're trying to start to do that with the center. Thanks.
Yes. We're down to our final question. Time's ahead, and I saw the hand up here. Please go ahead, and that will conclude us.
Thanks to the panelists. My name's Logan Lawrence. I'm a PhD health candidate here. My question's for Sandra. You mentioned that union members have fear around change. And I'm wondering, from a policy response, what's the role of governments to help people who are going to be negatively affected by change, to help them through that transition process?
So, I think there's a variety of different things. When you say specifically about the role of government, I think that this is actually going to be a role for all of us. So I go back to Sunil's point that we need to be responsible for the decisions that we make as consumers. It's as important as a good government response. But I also believe that there needs to be a narrative that grows. There needs to be a story. People need someone to tell them what's happening. And whether that comes from government, in many ways, there's been a struggle with people in terms of trust. And although having worked in government for 900 years, I can tell you that I never worked with, I don't believe I ever worked with anyone that wasn't trying to do the best they could. And I'm encouraged by all the MPA students that I've met through the years in terms of wanting to go to make a better world. But finding that narrative that we can all wrap our arms around, and that is something that's actually lacking right now. So there's a general fear, not just among workers, but amongst people, about parents for their children, and children for the environment, and those types of things. And people need to say, what is the story? Where are we going? And does government have a role in that? Yes, we all have a role in that, and that we are not using social media to the extent that we could be able to build that narrative, and that people can onboard to that and feel that they can contribute and be safe into the future.
Thank you very much. We've reached our time that we need to conclude for today. I want to thank our panelists again so very much. I want to thank you all for coming with us. And remember, yes. And remember that with each of our topics that we have in the Policy Matters series, we're seeking to move our discussion, our engagement with that forward in an independent and informed way. And I appreciate your contributions to that and the questions contributions. Thank you, Kevin.